Yes, I feel as if I'm slightly here under false pretenses because I know the original speaker, keynote speaker for this conference was a colleague of mine, friend Mike Parker-Pearson, who's carried out a lot of the more recent excavation research in the Stonehenge landscape as part of his Stonehenge Riverside project, and has also been very heavily involved with a lot of the recent genetic studies, the DNA studies that have been taking place, which I'm going to attempt to explain to you this afternoon because the complexities of those I find quite baffling at times, and I'm sure Mike would have been a better person to explain that, but Mike is unfortunately not well and couldn't make it, so I'm the stand-in. So the title that I gave, I think, was sort of, recent discoveries and more speculation, because one thing that seems to be almost inevitable is that whatever research is carried out while producing some results will inevitably raise another series of questions. And as somebody who sits back and digests the result of recent research and analyses it and thinks about it, the recent research, particularly genetic research, has actually thrown up a lot of questions in my mind, which I hope to share with you this afternoon. So not promising any answers, just perhaps a lot more questions. One of them is going to be about who the builders of Stonehenge were. Because having been involved with this monument, this absolutely wonderful monument and its landscape now for nearly 40 years now, next August marks my 40th year of involvement with Stonehenge and its landscape, there's a series of key questions that you always have to ask. Firstly, what is it? And I'm not planning this afternoon and going through what Stonehenge is and its structure, because hopefully that's all familiar to you. And questions about why, its sequence, which, although recent research has illuminated that a lot more, there are still questions, as you'll see a bit later, about the exact sequence of events that took place at Stonehenge when certain elements of it were built and certain elements of it arrived. And then you get on to the questions of who and why, the really difficult ones. And it's the who question that has maybe been addressed by some of the more recent studies of human remains, looking at isotopes, looking at the DNA, and trying to pick a very broad picture out of what are sometimes some quite small samples. Now, yesterday evening, I was at Stonehenge. I was very lucky. There was a big sleep event at the Visitor Centre last night, and I got to walk up to the stones with all the people who are involved in that. I'm afraid I didn't sleep out at the Visitor Centre last night because I thought I'd be too sleepy today to come along and do this. But wandering up to the stones in the company of some young army cadets, one of them said to me, "Built by aliens, wasn't it?" And, I sort of, no, I really don't think that, I think we've moved slightly beyond that. But, it's still apparently a common theory amongst many people. But that question about who built it has been with us for centuries, since the medieval period. And of course, it was very easy to explain the construction of Stonehenge in the early medieval period, because you could evoke mythology. It was a stone circle that originally stood in Ireland. It was flown over by Merlin and re-erected on Salisbury Plain with the help of giants. This was an acceptable history at that time. A way of explaining something that seemed inexplicable, something that, because of its structure, was unique. There wasn't anything else like it anywhere else. And so how do you explain the unique? It's very difficult. You can't compare it to lots of other examples and make general statements. So to the medieval mind, that was a perfectly acceptable history. And then, of course, you find that as we move into the era of antiquarian and pioneering archaeological work in the 17th and 18th centuries, people looked at Stonehenge, and in it they saw something far more sophisticated than any other stone circle in the British Isles. There was something more polite about it. It was refined. It was architectural. And of course, that therefore could not possibly have been a product of the native inhabitants of the British Isles. Because as everybody knew, those native inhabitants were rude, skin-clad savages who lived in holes in the ground and couldn't possibly have built anything as sophisticated as Stonehenge. There's a wonderful phrase uttered by one 18th century antiquarian who says the ancient Britons were only 1 or 2 degrees less savage than the Americans. And I think, yeah, no, all right, no. Yes, I can see where you're coming from with that. But this was talking about the Native Americans, I think. But, you know, there was that perception. And so therefore, you looked to a more sophisticated culture as an influence. And so you looked at it and thought, must be Roman. It's unlike anything else. It must be built by the Romans. And so this is where you find Inigo Jones creating this wonderful symmetrical plan of Stonehenge, showing how it fits in with the rules, the geometrical rules of Roman architecture. It has this symmetry, except, of course, it doesn't. Except that to do this, Inigo Jones had to add a 6th trilithon and bend the others around from the horseshoe shape that they're actually in to create this. So, no, it doesn't fit. You can't make it into something Roman simply by fudging the plan. But there was this tendency to look for something more sophisticated. Interestingly, in the early 18th century, William Stukely, that great pioneering field archaeologist really, to whom we owe so much of our understanding of places like Avebury and the Avebury landscape and the Stonehenge landscape, because of the recording work that he did, sometimes while sites were actually in the process of destruction. But it was Stukely that firmly nailed it and said, okay, it's built by the ancient Britons, it is a temple. And of course, it was that association. It's ancient British, it's a temple, temples need priests. Who are the only priests that we know of the ancient Britons? The Druids, because they're written about by classical writers. Therefore, that association was made. But Stukely was exactly right about it being ancient British. And of course, even in more recent times, you will find people trying to evoke something somehow more sophisticated as a reason for Stonehenge being built. And when these famous dagger and axe carvings were found in the early 1950s, discovered solely when Atkinson was photographing more modern graffiti and noticed something that is patently obvious on photographs taken in the Victorian period, but nobody had actually looked at it. That dagger, to some, immediately evoked a link with a civilization, in this case, Mycenae. It looks like a dagger from the Mycenaean shaft graves. Therefore, a Mycenaean architect must have come over and taught these unsophisticated Britons how to build something as sophisticated as Stonehenge. Except that doesn't work because chronologically the Mycenaean shaft graves are a lot later than Stonehenge, and also the dagger and the axe are perfectly acceptable local Bronze Age forms. Admittedly, added to those stones probably 600, maybe 700 years after they were erected, but they're nothing to do with Mycenae. But there was still that element of let's look beyond the shores of Britain to something more sophisticated. Those are the daggers, the sorts that were found in the burials all around Stonehenge when excavated by Courtmore and Cunnington in the early 19th century that are represented on the stones. Even in more recent times, it's quite interesting to see who has been evoked as somehow the architect, the builder of Stonehenge. Those barrows, that is Bush Barrow, the famous burial to the south of Stonehenge, still denoted by the fact that it's got a bush on it. Because when we cleared all of the scrub off those barrows, about 10, 15 years ago, we left a bush on Bush Barrow solely so that when you look at those barrows from Stonehenge and people say, which one is Bush Barrow? It's the one with the bush on it. But that obviously produced this amazing grave group in 1808, Cunnington's excavations, and you can still see these wonderful objects in the Wiltshire Museum at Devizes, the gold breastplate, the belt hook, the sceptre. This is the old reconstruction that used to appear in, it was in Devizes Museum, which was fondly known as Mr. Buckethead, because for some strange reason, the concept of a helmet, which had been suggested as being made of wooden staves, resulted in this poor chap being given a wooden bucket on his head. But he was seen, okay, he's a rich person, he's in the landscape, he must be the builder of Stonehenge. And then in the 1980s, we find the Stonehenge guidebook has reconstructions like this, where that chap with the sceptre, he's wearing the little gold diadem on his head, with all the other accoutrements, is directing the construction of Stonehenge. Except that this doesn't work for two very good reasons. Firstly, that the bush barrow burial dates to maybe 1900 BC at the very earliest, and this is all going on in about 2500 BC, so chronologically it doesn't work. And also, despite what Ivan Lapper put in his picture, Stonehenge was not built by Kirk Douglas. Because Ivan liked to put real people in his picture, and I don't know whether you can identify his two assistants, but there's Michael Heseltine and George Best. So they were not the people who built Stonehenge. So it's this, we're always trying to find somebody. And of course, interestingly, in around, I think it was about 2000, when that very celebrated burial of the Amesbury Archer was discovered. Now, this is somebody clearly of enormous wealth and significance. This is the earliest Beaker burial, Beaker grave group in this country. It's also one of the richest, because if you're going to have a beaker, it's nice to have a beaker. This chap had 6. He's also got copper daggers. He's got gold hair tresses. He's got beautiful flint arrowheads. He's got stone wrist guards. He's got an anvil, which shows that probably he was a metal worker. So he was somebody who introduced metalworking into this country. He's got copper, he's got gold, the first metals to appear. And so as such, he would have been a person of great significance. I've always envisaged him as being sort of an extremely wealthy travelling salesman. Because the intriguing thing was that when he was discovered, this was a time that isotope analysis, which by examining isotopes of lead, strontium, oxygen in people's bones, can actually pinpoint the journeys that they've made in life, the place where they were born, or rather the geology where they were born, and then identified movement throughout their life. And what these showed was that this person was, as you might have expected really, he wasn't local. He was an immigrant. So presumably these days, there'd be great attempts being made to keep him out, wouldn't there? From Central Europe. And of course, he immediately became dubbed in some cases the King of Stonehenge. Suddenly there was this association, despite the fact that he was buried about 2.5 miles away on the other side of the river at Amesbury. He wasn't buried anywhere close to Stonehenge. But there was this association. He was the King of Stonehenge. Was he the architect? I do love the way that the tabloids showed this, because he was thought... This was the Daily Mail. Comedy German. Achtung, Great British Monument may be. And here, archaeologists believe the King of Stonehenge. Now, was it built by a German? No, it wasn't. Firstly, he's not German anyway. He's probably from sort of Austria, Swiss border, somewhere like that. Also, he's just a little bit too late. He's a little bit too late to have had anything to do with the great rebuilding of Stonehenge in stone that took place just a little bit before that. So, but there's still this temptation to look for an exotic influence, in this case, some wealthy chap from Europe coming in and going, oh, I'd like you to build one of these. That is not going to happen. I've always likened the Stonehenge archer to being like the person who, the rich person who's maybe made their money as, a computer entrepreneur who moves into an established village and builds a flash house on the edge of the village, but nobody lets him be on the PCC or the village hall committee or anything like that because he's a rich newcomer. He's not part of that establishment. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So where do we find the builders of Stonehenge, the architects, the people who created the idea and then actually constructed this great monument? Now, frustratingly, this is at a time where we don't have a great deal of burial evidence, although we do have burials at Stonehenge itself. We have cremated remains buried in the Aubrey holes and in the ditch. And this is a question of, well, who is it? Who are these people? And this is where the first of these genetic studies comes in, because we understand quite a lot about the origins of agriculture in Europe and the spread of agriculture across Europe. And if we look to sites like Lipensky Vir, this is a loop in the Danube, we can see the origins of agriculture dating back to way before 5000 BC. And here we can see the interaction between hunter-gatherers, the indigenous inhabitants who are leading this hunter-gatherer way of life, and pioneering agriculturalists. And it's an interesting relationship because it seems to vary around Europe. In some cases, there is an adoption by hunter-gatherer groups of agriculture as a practice, because after all, some of these Mesolithic hunter-gatherers are actively adapting the landscape themselves. They're doing things like burning areas of forest to create clearing. So they're not actually farming, but they are modifying their natural environment. There is even evidence in one or two places of agriculturalists almost reverting to a hunter-gatherer way of life. And I can actually see why you would do that under certain circumstances, because it's a lot easier way of making a living. But in this country, we do have, because we have become an island, we would become an island in around 7000 BC, we do have an influx of people along with these ideas and domesticated animals and crops sometime before 4000 BC, and quite how much before 4000 BC is slightly debatable, but we're seeing people from the continent. They have to come in, they have to bring these ideas in, you have to bring domesticated animals in. And this is a great change. Now, this is a reconstruction of a person who's buried in one of the long barrows close to Stonehenge. This is at a slightly later date. This is around 3600, 3500 BC. But he is the descendant of one of these early farmers. And we can see on the continent the influences that are coming in. We see settlements, these linear band ceramic settlements in the Low Countries, Germany, where you've got classically built long houses, clusters of them, agricultural settlements. And it's these ideas of long houses, agriculture, ceramics that are coming into this country. And what's fascinating is that although we do have some, maybe not that many, long houses of this type in this country, they're increasingly starting to turn up on development sites. It's geophysical survey underneath long barrows, underneath Neolithic long barrows, that now seems to be consistently producing evidence of timber structures. This is one that's quite close to Woodhenge in the Stonehenge landscape that was surveyed by the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute as part of their Stonehenge Hidden Landscape project. And what you've got here is a trapezoidal timber structure with slots, post holes, divisions. And I'm not suggesting that that is a Neolithic house that's then been buried by under a mound as a house of the dead rather than the house of the living. Although I suppose there is the possibility that that was a house of the living, and that reduced to ground level, that formed the template for the barrow that sat on top of it. But we can see all of these influences coming in, and this has been the subject of one of the genetic studies, to look at the change from the Western hunter-gatherer group to the European Neolithic group. The big problem is in finding samples to use for a genetic study like this, because in this country we don't have a great tradition of Mesolithic burial, of hunter-gatherer burial. And so that aspect of it, the hunter-gatherer side, the pre-Neolithic, there were just 6 available samples, including the famous Cheddar Man. This is a very wide range of dates as well. In contrast, there were 67 available early Neolithic samples because it is a time when we're starting to find formal burial in recognisable places, burial within long barrows. So at least we have a decent range of samples. Now what I struggle with, and I'm not going to attempt to explain the complexities of the DNA studies, but what I find myself personally difficult to understand is how it's possible from such a small sample to suggest almost a complete population replacement over most of the country, and that the Western hunter-gatherer group simply disappears except for one or two pockets and is replaced quite rapidly by the European Neolithic incomers. As I say, we don't have the Mesolithic burial record in this country. If you go over the North Sea, or in fact you go across what would have at that time been Doggerland, not necessarily sea but a very low-lying swampy area, to Denmark, there you do have a very rich Mesolithic burial tradition. You have these wonderful sites, is it Liebeck, where burial of a woman with a baby, with the baby lying on a swan's wing. Extraordinarily formal burials, and quite a lot of them. We simply don't have that tradition in this country. In contrast, we can recognise our early Neolithic burial record because certain people, and I think this is one thing that again should be emphasised, is that presumably an elite are buried within long barrows. Not everybody is getting burial in a long barrow. But what's intriguing about the burials, for example, from somewhere like West Kennet that's been totally excavated and the burials have been studied in great detail, is that not only are those burials not going in over a very long period of time, as we might have thought, but they're going in over quite a short period of time, but that amongst those burials you've got the young and the old, and you've got male and you've got female. So we've got everybody from children to elderly people, with the implication being that by this time there is a hierarchy. You are born into an elite. You're not achieving elite status and therefore a place in a burial mound by what you do in life, unless it's possible for a child to have done something in their very early years that gives them that status. It seems more likely that if you were born into that status, that entitled you to burial in a structure like this. And it's the same sort of thing that we find in the pagan Saxon period, where you will find children buried with full-size weapons. The implication being that those children were destined to be warriors, but the fact that they died young and didn't actually reach adult status and become a warrior, it still meant that they were buried with symbols that denote their warrior status, their warrior class. So it's interesting because what we're doing is comparing a very small number of Mesolithic samples with a larger number of Neolithic ones, but all of which were buried in a special way. What happens to the rest of the Mesolithic and the Neolithic population, who I feel should be the ones to actually give us a better handle on what is going on? And I still find it very difficult, this suggestion that there is this complete replacement, because all over the country we have a very rich Mesolithic culture. You can go to places like Starcar in Yorkshire, a very famous site, probably most famous for the amazing antler frontlets, with the implication that these were actually worn as part of some sort of ceremony. You can go to places like the Kennet Valley in Berkshire, very, very intensively studied by one field worker in the 1970s, where there is dense Mesolithic activity spreading right the way through that period from about 8000 BC to a time when it's overlapping with Neolithic activity on the nearby Berkshire Downs. Because these are places that have got very rich resources. You've got flint for your tools from the nearby chalk, you've got water, you've got animals coming to the river to drink, so you can hunt deer of various sorts, you've got fish in the river, you've got beavers. Basically, you've got everything that you need to lead a very nice, comfortable life without having to become agricultural. And the idea that all of this completely disappears and this population disappears is something that I still struggle with, I still find quite difficult to understand, despite what the genetics are apparently telling us. And of course, within the Stonehenge landscape, we've got this key site of Blickmead, the Mesolithic site down by the side of the River Avon, an extraordinary place which I think, unfortunately, some slightly strange claims have been made about it, which almost detract from its significance, because it is a hugely important place. It's centred on a warm spring, a rare warm spring that stays at a constant, I think it's something like 15 degrees, so never freezes. So of course this would have been amazingly attractive to animals, because it would have been somewhere that they could come and drink. It would have had probably green vegetation all year round. And it's not surprising that that spring became the focus of hunter-gatherer activity over thousands of years. From the radiocarbon dates there, I think, range from about 7,000 BC right up to now, a time when they are within a few hundred years of the earliest Neolithic dates within the Stonehenge landscape. And the excavations there, carried out by David Jakes and the University of Buckingham and a lot of volunteers from Amesbury, have produced an extraordinary rich assemblage of Mesolithic artefacts and the bones of aurochs, these rather scary giant cattle. So it's an extremely important place. Is all this just suddenly disappearing? I was very fortunate in 1980 and 81 to excavate a pit. And I think it's the most exciting thing that I've ever dug, because when people say, what's the most exciting thing you've ever found? And they expect you to say a bronze dagger. And my response is a pit full of early Neolithic rubbish. Because this was located just outside Coneybury Henge. I was actually there to dig the henge, but because I'm a nosy person, on the geophysical survey, a large pit turned up. And because it was a geophysical anomaly, it became known as the Coneybury anomaly. But is now more properly referred to as the Coneybury feasting pit. But this, to me, is fascinating because it shows, to my mind, the meeting of two economies, if not cultures. Because the animal bones, and there were literally thousands of animal bones in this pit, include a mixture of everything from wild animals, there's red deer, there's roe deer, there's beaver, there's salmon from the river, and then there's domesticated animals. There's cattle, there's pig, and there's sheep. So here we've got represented things that are being hunted, things that are being herded. And I always felt that what this pit looked like, and it's clearly Neolithic because it's got radiocarbon dates of about 3,900 BC, and it's got domesticated animals, and it's got pottery as well, was almost as if a group of people who were still leading a hunter-gatherer way of life had met up with some agriculturalists and had a big party, or several parties, and then had buried all the debris. And it's fascinating that recent isotopic analysis of the bones and looking at where they've come from, some local, some not quite so local, has virtually come to the same conclusion based on a very detailed scientific study that this almost looks like the meeting of two groups of people who are both bringing something to the feast. So it's a fascinating time, but as I say, it's something that I do struggle with slightly in terms of just a complete population replacement at this time. So has Cheddar Man been replaced by these people all of a sudden? And I don't know, maybe further research, maybe further sampling is going to throw more light on this. The reason I show Stonehenge as a kebab is because, of course, this is again the way people interpret things. Earliest origins of agriculture, Turkey, that sort of area. So inevitably, I found this on the internet where somebody had stuck a giant kebab in the middle of Stonehenge. Not a serious suggestion. The next stage at which we are apparently getting a complete population replacement again is at that time, the time of the time of the Amesbury Archer. Because what we can see at that time is a change in the burial record. We're now getting single burial with objects, with these very distinctive bell beakers, with the first metals. And this isn't the Bronze Age. This is a weird period that we refer to as the Chalcolithic. So in other words, it's a metal-using Stone Age, which is a very confusing way of archaeologists putting it. But it's a time when effectively you're still leading a Neolithic way of life, but first metals are coming in. And we can see this spreading across the continent. We can see its origins in Iberia, Portugal, Spain, and then spreading across the continent and finally reaching Britain in probably around 2450 BC. So just maybe even at the time when Stonehenge was being rebuilt in stone, or potentially just after it. So we can see the continental origins of this. We can see these beakers, and of course, as I said already, the Amesbury Archer is a prime example of this type of burial, and incredibly early and incredibly important. So we look at, where are these people coming from? Are all of them coming from the continent? The pots are very distinctive, so you can actually identify the graves. And of course, what we're looking at here is, formal burial, so we have actually got a larger number of samples. And because the objects themselves are so diagnostic, we can actually pick them out and go, right, that is a very early beaker, because obviously what you don't want to do is to sample later beakers, because they may well muddy the picture. And what is being suggested at this point, again, is that there is an almost complete total population replacement within almost a few generations by these European incomers. Now, this again, as a practical person, as well as somebody who is supposed to absorb this science, I find very difficult to understand, because the other suggestion that goes along with this as well is that what you have at the end of the Neolithic is a population in decline. That's why it is easy for a group of incomers who are bringing new technology, a new economy, to actually undertake this replacement. Now that's all very well, but if you're suggesting that this late Neolithic population is in decline, it seems to me extraordinary that at this time, this is when they are doing things like this, that they are rebuilding Stonehenge in stone. The massive stone phase where you're introducing approximately 80 massive sarsens from the Marlborough Downs 20 miles away. You may be bringing 80 bluestones from Wales at this time, although as we'll explore in a few minutes, they may have been there already. But this is the massive rebuilding that's taking place at this time. It's also at the time that Durrington Walls, this vast quarter of a mile across earthwork enclosure, only a mile or so away by the River Avon, is being constructed. This huge earthwork which buries an existing village and timber circles. It's at the same time that Avebury is being built. Look at the scale of that. Silbury is being built. And all over the British Isles, it's a time of excessive, massive structures being built. Now, how, if you have a declining population, a reduced population, maybe even a weakened population, are they actually able to do all of this? This is what I struggle with. You could argue that sometimes constructing things on a monumental scale is something that is done by societies that are in crisis. They know that they are under stress. They know that they are, if you like, on the way out. They are perceiving a threat. And in this case, they would be perceiving a threat from incomers with a new sort of economy. And so therefore, you just do completely mad things. And if you look, I know it's probably not a very good example, but if you look at, what was built in Harare in Zimbabwe, gigantic conference centres that would never ever be filled by people, vast sports stadia, these sort of huge structures, they're gestures of defiance almost. Is this what we're seeing at the end of the Neolithic? I don't know the answer to that, but it's one way of explaining why you're getting the construction of monuments on this scale. Silbury to me is the classic example, because although you might be able to find a use in some way for stone circles, places like Durrington, Avebury, Stonehenge itself, most archaeologists I know still struggle to actually find a reason for Silbury Hill, except to say that it was the building of it that was important, because it brought people together to create this great structure, and therefore you were part of something. But you know, it's a hell of a lot of work to create social unity. So this is a very interesting question. One thing I do find fascinating as well is that, you know, everybody makes so much of the Amesbury archer simply because of his wealth. But that other archer, the Stonehenge archer, the chap who's slightly later than him, but who was found buried in the ditch at Stonehenge, he hasn't got the riches, but is he somebody that's actually more significant? Because he was called the Stonehenge archer. I mean, the Amesbury archer, he's got stone wrist guards, he's got beautiful barbed and tanged arrowheads. So has the Stonehenge archer. He's got a stone wrist guard, he's got barbed and tanged arrowheads, but he's not buried with a quiver of arrows as a sign of his occupation. The arrows were in his body when he was buried. The tips of the arrows are almost all of them broken. I'm afraid this isn't one of them. And the tips are actually embedded in his bones. So he's been shot 5 times with the flint-tipped arrows from close range. The last one, probably when he was lying flat on the ground and he was shot from close range from behind, because one arrow tip is embedded in his sternum, in the breastbone, but on the inside of it. So, you know, and he's a local. His isotopes suggest that he grew up on the chalk, but he was given a very, very special place of burial in the ditch at Stonehenge. And those people who go, oh, he was a murder victim, you're not going to try and bury somebody secretly in the ditch at Stonehenge. It's going to be fairly obvious. He was placed there deliberately because somehow he was a special person. So we do have puzzles at this time. Yes, just sort of going back to Silbury, you know, this idea, you know, here is something truly monumental, but without any apparent function. So we do have this problem, though, in terms of sampling, because we have people buried with beakers, so they are the group who we can almost suggest are going to be incomers by definition, because they're buried with these special objects, they're buried in a formal way. But we do have a problem with where are the late Neolithic dead? Because ideally, you would like those as a comparative sample. But we don't really know, in a lot of cases, what they were doing with their dead at this time. We just do not find them. Those cremation burials at Stonehenge that I talked about and refer back to, they date mainly to the centuries between about 3000 and 2700 BC, perhaps slightly later. So they're not from this time at the very end of the Neolithic. And I did make the suggestion that if you're looking for a way of disposing of the dead in a way that doesn't leave any trace whatsoever, then pigs are a very good way of doing it. Because at Durrington Walls, which is the contemporary settlement within the Stonehenge landscape, there's a lot of evidence for people eating pigs, for feasting on pig bones, maybe at certain times of the year. And they're also doing some rather strange things with pigs, including shooting some of them with flint-tipped arrows, which is not an efficient way of killing a pig. It's more likely to make a pig angry than it is to kill it. But what, and this is a completely throwaway line, what if you're feeding the dead to your pigs and you're then feasting on the pigs? You're ingesting the ancestors, but in a way that removes all of the problems that you have with cannibalism. It's an interesting thought, absolutely unprovable, because there is no way of looking at isotopes in pig bones to see whether they ate people. But it was just a sort of an idea that came to me one day, because I personally find pigs quite terrifying. I've only ever once been in a pen with a load of pigs, and I was aware that if I fell over, they'd probably eat me. So it was just a thought, but it just maybe shows the fevered way in which my mind works. So those Let's go back to those cremations at Stonehenge, because they, and the analysis of those, has actually taught us quite a lot. It was John Aubrey who noted a series of cavities, hollows in the ground, just inside the bank at Stonehenge. And so, therefore, when these were excavated, some of them were excavated in the 1920s, they were given the name Aubrey holes after the person that first noted them. I mean, intriguingly, William Stukely didn't notice them, and he was a great observer. But anyway, those are the Aubrey holes, of which we are fairly certain that there are 56 lying just inside the bank. Stonehenge, as you're probably aware, has had a lot of excavation. And the big purple splodge around here is Colonel Hawley in basically the 1920s, the early 1920s, who, as part of restoration work, but also as part of a brief to excavate the whole of Stonehenge, got as far as doing half of it before mercifully he ran out of steam and energy. But he did dig not the bank, but the ditch, and also all the Aubrey holes that lay in a sweep around there. And what those consistently produced, as you can see from the red dots here, were cremations. All of these Aubrey holes produced cremations, and some in the ditch as well. Now, I presume that we can extrapolate out and go, there's probably cremations in all the Aubrey holes around here as well. But they had no idea what to do with those bones. It wasn't thought that you could actually understand anything from cremated bones. Salisbury Museum wouldn't have them, so they sat in Hawley's and other people's attics until 1935, when a couple of people went back to Aubrey Hole 7, which was one of the larger ones that they'd excavated, and they simply tipped all of the cremated bones back into Aubrey Hole 7. Now that's in some ways good that they didn't just chuck them away. When I was part of the team that re-excavated this pit in 2008, we had this naive idea that they might have all been in little individual Hessian bags that they'd placed in the bottom of the pit. But no, they had just tipped the whole lot in, with the result that there was about a foot deep deposit in the bottom of the pit of thousands and thousands and thousands of fragments of cremated bone. But the thing about prehistoric cremations as against modern ones, where bones are crushed up in a drum full of ball bearings so that they're unrecognisable, is that you do get big bits. I mean, these were bits that I just fished out. There's the head of a femur, there's the back of a skull showing where the muscle attachments are, so you can tell quite a lot about the people. And so they've been analysed in detail. One of the reasons for digging them up at that time was that for the first time it was possible to radiocarbon date cremated bones, because it was, up until then, it had been thought that all the organic matter, all the collagen in the bones had been destroyed by the cremation process and couldn't be analysed. But they could now be radiocarbon dated. And so what we have is probably around 60-ish individuals, men, women, small number of children, and date range. A lot of them, hardly surprisingly, occur quite early in Stonehenge's history, from around 3000 BC up to about 2600. And in fact, some of them might even predate the digging of the ditch and bank, with the possibility that some of them go on slightly later than that. But more recently, it's been interesting to look at the isotopes within those bones and to see where those people might have come from. Now, what we have here also, though, is there's a question, another question. Did those bones arrive at Stonehenge as cremated bones? Had they been picked out of a pyre somewhere else and put in a bag and brought to Stonehenge? Or did people come to that area and were then cremated there and buried? And of course, this is quite an interesting question, and it's something that we cannot prove one way or the other. But one of the things that's interesting is that some of the bones, the isotopic evidence from some of the bones, suggests that they are not local. And there is the possibility that they're pointing to Wales. But it's a sort of slightly circular argument. They are not from the chalk geology. They are not from a young geology like the chalk. And if you actually look at some of the publications, it sort of says, and the temptation is because we know that there's an association between where the stones came from and Stonehenge, to look to that area. Now that's a slightly circular argument. If you hadn't got the stone link, would you be looking in that direction, or would you be looking just at an area of old geology? But it is a possibility that some of those cremated bones in the Albury holes have actually come from people in Wales. And although people are stretching it to go, oh yes, it's the bluestone delivery men, who were so exhausted when they got here that they died and were cremated and buried there, there is a possibility, and it is cementing that very important link between Preseli and Stonehenge. Because what we can be absolutely certain of, and this was realised in the 1920s when geological work sampling rocks in Preseli and the rocks at Stonehenge, was that the smaller stones, described by Colt Hoare as the pygmy pillars in a rather derogatory way, these are from Wales. They are from the Preseli Hills in Wales. And they are both slabs, unworked slabs, of a variety of types of stone, now set up in a circle concentric with the outer sarsen circle, but not in their original position, or they're very finely worked pillars, now in a horseshoe concentric with the horseshoe of sarsen trilithons, but again, not in their original position. These being more portable, weighing only up to about 3 tons, are movable. Once you get those in place, you're not going to move those, but these have been rearranged probably about 3 centuries after they were put in one setting. Now, up until quite recently as well, there's been a tendency to point to a particular rock outcrop in Preseli. This is Carnmenin, and say, look, this is where most of the stones come from. A lot of recent work has gone on here by people like Rob Ixer and Mike Parker-Pearson's team have been working in that area, and they've now identified a number of locations where stones have come from. And indeed, in fact, in some cases where individual stones at Stonehenge can be pinpointed to a particular quarry face. So you've got Carn Godog, you've got Craig Rossifelin, where a lot of excavation work has taken place, and where there is obvious extraction of stones, but not, unfortunately, at a date which fits in with Stonehenge slightly earlier, which of course does lead to the suggestion, which I made quite a few years ago, which is that what came from Stonehenge wasn't simply a collection of building material, but was a stone circle, something that had already been constructed, where the stones in it were already of some significance, and it was this that was uprooted and brought to Stonehenge. And Mike, who I have to admire for his perseverance, has been looking in Preseli for the place where the stones originally stood. Now, I've always felt that that is a bit like looking for a needle in a haystack, but Mike is an extraordinarily lucky archaeologist, but he hasn't found it to date. It may be there somewhere, but trying to find a site with a lot of empty stone sockets that just fit the number that are at Stonehenge would be an unbelievable discovery. So maybe he'll be back next year to tell you about the unbelievable discovery that he's made in Preseli. I put this one in just to demonstrate the differentness of some of the Stonehenge stones, because if you go to Stonehenge today, what you see, everything looks the same. It's 1,000 years of weathering, it's lichen. When freshly worked, and not all of those blue stones were actually worked, but some of them were, that is the contrast between the spotted dolerite and freshly worked sarsen. It would have been very obvious. Those Welsh stones would have appeared exotic, different, something that was definitely not local. Mind you, even the sarsens aren't that local, but they would have appeared very different. So this leads on to another question. When did the blue stones arrive at Stonehenge? And a lot of these questions, we cannot answer them definitively. It's a matter of interpretation and a matter of different people interpreting the archaeological evidence in different ways. There are 2 possibilities. Those Albury holes, when they were first excavated by Hawley, he first thought that they held small stones. No evidence, no stones in them, and a remarkable absence of stone chippings in them, or indeed in the ditch in its lower deposits. But he was persuaded to change his mind when Woodhenge was discovered a few years later, a site with timber circles where the post holes were there, traces of the rotted timbers. And he sort of changed his mind and said, okay, well, maybe there were timber posts in those. So it's gone backwards and forwards, timber stone, timber stone. So in reconstructions that I've commissioned, it tends to show timber, and in reconstructions that Mike has commissioned, it tends to show stone. And Mike's interpretation, a lot of it, is based on the excavation of Aubrey Hole 7. Now, I'm slightly wary of this because that was a hole that was dug originally in 2500 BC. It was then excavated by Hawley, I think in 1920. It was then re-excavated in 1935 to put the cremated bones in, and it was re-excavated in 2008 when we emptied it out. So it's not exactly pristine archaeological evidence. And I was not convinced, and I dug the bottom of that hole, that there was evidence for a stone sitting in it, because a stone will actually compress the chalk and compact it. I was not convinced that that evidence was there. So fundamentally, what we need to do is to excavate a couple of undisturbed Aubrey holes. But I'm not going to suggest that to English Heritage. I'm not that brave. But that would be one way of actually answering that question. And there are a lot of other questions. Tim Darville and Jeff Wainwright in that same year, 2008, excavated a small area to try and work out when the blue stones arrived in their first setting. And what they found was a massive amount of disturbance, including a lot of Roman activity, so much so that it suggested that Stonehenge might have been modified as a Roman shrine. But they did not date the first arrival of the blue stones. What they did show was that there'd been a huge amount of destruction. You know, little stumps like this surviving below ground and everything above ground having gone. And this led them to one of their ideas about why the stones were being broken up. And also, we've got this puzzle in that we have two, at least, bluestone lintels, showing that somewhere, some of the bluestones stood as miniature trilithons. But was it at Stonehenge? Was it somewhere else? Was it in Wales? I mean, the fundamental thing is what we need to find is a bluestone that somebody has dropped on the way between Preseli and Stonehenge and see whether it's shaped or not. But unfortunately, we haven't found any. But the question becomes more complicated when we look at recently discovered evidence, in this case, a brand new henge monument at the end of the avenue close to the River Avon. It was thought that the avenue ditches would probably go right down to the River Avon, which is just over here. They didn't. They stopped at a henge. Here's the ditch. It had an internal bank, and inside it, an arc of pits dug into the soft soil and with flint lining the bottom of them. Mike interprets these as being holes for stones, and Mike refers to this as blue Stonehenge. On the basis that there isn't a single fragment of bluestone from the whole site, I prefer to call it West Amesbury Henge, because we cannot be certain that those holes held bluestones in the way that Mike suggests. But there's a very interesting numbers game that you can play, because if the Aubrey holes had stones in them, 56, and if there were 24 stones at Blue Stonehenge, which is the projected number of pits from the whole site, then they do add up to 80, which is the number of stones that we actually think arrived in the first place. But there's a lot of things that are uncertain about this, so we cannot be 100% certain when the blue stones arrived at Stonehenge. Were they there very early, before the Saracens arrived, or did they all arrive at the same time as part of a great rebuilding in stone? Interesting. Different ideas, different opinions. Nobody can say that they are right, I'm afraid. This is something quite uncertain. Let's just go back briefly to those cremations, because this is, and that question of how do we understand Stonehenge in terms of how it was used? What was its purpose? Now, I understand that Simon Banton, a great friend of mine, came and talked to you about the astronomical aspects of Stonehenge last year. And Simon is the person who I defer to about this because I don't understand a lot of it. But there are three ideas, fundamental ideas, about why Stonehenge was built. One of them is to do with the dead. It's to do with the burials that were found there. And Mike Parker-Pearson uses analogies with Madagascar. He's done a lot of work with a Madagascan colleague called Ramisalina. And Mike's idea is that Stonehenge is a place of the dead and that there is a land of the living, that timber circles, as found at Woodhenge and Durrington, that is the land of the living. And that this is, if you talk to people from Madagascar, the Ramisalina says, stone is for the dead, timber is for the living. It's that simple. I don't think it's quite that simple because, yes, there are stone tombs in Madagascar and there are man stones, but there is also ancestry embodied in hardwood trees like baobab trees as well. So I don't think the distinction is actually quite as simple as that. I'm also not convinced that you can take something directly from present-day Madagascar and apply it to Neolithic Wessex. Anthropological evidence is very useful, but I think you have to be careful about how you use it. So that's the idea. Land of the living, Durrington walls, and in fact that does work because excavations there have produced evidence of Neolithic houses of the same date as the rebuilding of Stonehenge in stone, around 2500 BC, very end of the Neolithic. So yes, this is the land of the living. These consistent house plans of a small chalk floor with a hearth, light wall around them. So, a land of the living, and Stonehenge is the land of the dead. How big that village at Durrington was, we don't know, because I think 7 houses have been found so far, but there are hints that there were more of them in other places that have been investigated, so it could be quite a substantial settlement there before the huge earthwork enclosure was built. But the unfortunate thing is that chronologically there are problems with this idea. Because if you're living at Durrington in 2500 BC, according to Mike, you go, after you die, you go on a transformation from life to death, you travel up the route of the ancestral initiates, which is the avenue, but unfortunately that isn't built for another 200 years. So the route might have been thought of, but you can't actually travel up the avenue. And most of the cremation dates at Stonehenge are considerably earlier than that. So there are chronological flaws with this, although the basic principle is quite interesting. But actually, chronologically, the nail in the coffin was the dates from the Stonehenge cremations. Had they all been around 2500 BC, it would have worked very nicely, but unfortunately, it didn't. The other suggestion concerns the blue stones. Are they thought to have healing power? Is this why they're brought from Preseli? Because if you go to Preseli, there's a lot of folklore about the healing power of the stones, about water that flows over the stones. You'll find little springs with standing stones next to them. So are you bringing the stones there because you think that they have healing power? And to Tim Darville and the late great Jeff Wainwright, who did that last excavation there, to them the reason the stones were being broken up, the blue stones, was because people were taking away talisman, healing stones from there. Interesting idea, but difficult to prove. In fact, impossible to prove that that is why people were breaking the stones up. And unfortunately, you can't really use people like the Amesbury Archer to back this idea up because, yes, he did have a very bad leg. He got a sort of a very badly damaged leg with a missing kneecap. But I still find the idea that he hobbled all the way across Europe from Austria to be healed at Stonehenge a little far-fetched, I'm afraid. And the idea that was also expressed by some people that lots of the burial mounds had people with evidence of disease and trauma in them. It's a nice idea, but it's impossible to prove because the antiquarian excavators were only interested in the objects and they left the human remains there. So we don't have them to study. So an interesting idea, but essentially unprovable. To me, and this simplifies things enormously, the key thing about Stonehenge's use is something that's been there right from the time that the first earthwork was constructed and is embodied in those stone structures, and that is this key solstice alignment. And it's not about the summer, which is when people want to go because it's warmer, it's about the winter, the turning of the year, the point at which the days go from being shorter and darker and more dangerous, that turning point that the sun starts its journey again, and imperceptibly you know that spring is coming, that light and life will return. That to me is the key. That's the important thing about Stonehenge. But you know, people sort of say, well, how do you know? And I go, well, I don't. I wasn't there. Archaeology can tell you so much. Science can tell you so much. But it cannot even give the remotest hint about what ceremonies there might have been there, what form of priesthood there might have been there, because we haven't got any burials of people who we can identify as priests or shaman or anything like that. So we really have no idea. Were there processions? Was there singing? Was there smoke, music? I have no idea. The thing that always intrigues me, though, is that when you put all the stones back, you do actually get quite a forest of stones. And I understand you've already had a talk today about the acoustic properties of structures like this. You can only get glimpses of what goes on inside there if you're outside. And I think that ordinary people like me would have been out beyond the ditch and bank looking to see what was going on. And it's a bit like the way medieval churches were organised, where there was a screen. You were aware that behind that screen the priest was, you know, communicating with a god on your behalf. You'd hear sounds, you'd smell incense. You didn't exactly know what was going on, but you knew that it was all for your benefit. If you were outside there, maybe catching a glimpse of flame, of robes, of chanting of something, and then somebody came out and said, all is well, the sun will resume its journey. And you go, oh, thank heavens for that, the year has turned. To me, that's what was going on, and I would love to invent a time machine and go back to winter solstice in about 2200 BC, because then I would actually be able to tell you what went on there. Finally, and I'm aware that I've gone on a little bit, and I do tend to, the idea of stone transport. This is something that I find utterly fascinating, and something that, again, we can only find out about this by experimentation. And experiments might tell you how things might have been done. They won't tell you how they were done. And increasingly, although how to shift a 40-ton stone is something that is very high in, very much in my mind, the idea of how they got those stones from Wales to Stonehenge is absolutely fascinating. I've been very lucky over the last couple of years to be involved with some experiments at Stonehenge. English Heritage and one of my great friends and colleagues, Luke Winter, who used to run the ancient technology at Cranbourne. Luke was given told to find a large rock, and we'd experiment with how to move it. This is about between 3.5 and 4 tons, so it's slightly bigger than the biggest bluestones. And the first year, we just simply put a rope round it and dragged it on rollers and on various things, and it sort of worked. This year, the team there, using authentic tools, constructed a sledge and a cradle to mount it in, massively more efficient. And you think, yes, people would have put the effort into infrastructure. Not just throw more people at it, but think about it. This rolling on either rollers or on split timbers was hugely more efficient. And the fascinating thing was when we thought, okay, let's take it off the rollers and just put it on the grass and see how it works. We thought it was going to be really difficult. It was wonderful. It shot across the grass, and we reckon that if you did it at the right time of year, late summer, when there was dry grass to provide you with a really good running surface, this thing would move. So, it's those sort of experiments that make you think, that teach you a bit more about it. The other thing that I found intriguing was somewhere along that route, you're going to have to cross water. And I reckon that this, if you lashed some tree trunks to either side of it, you could float that. Not the stone sticking out the water, but with the stone in the water, you'd be able to provide enough buoyancy to keep the thing up. So if anybody's got a crane and a lorry and would like to help us take this down to the seaside, we'd really like to try and float it. But this is a practical application. This is trying to answer a question that science won't answer. It's given us some answers and posed a lot more questions about the origins of people, changes in population. This is something that can only be answered by experimentation. This is me in 1980. My first excavation in the Stonehenge landscape, when I was willing to be photographed stripped to the waist wearing skimpy denim shorts, which no, don't, please. And you really wouldn't want to see it today. I really would not do that again. Next year, I celebrate 40 years of involvement with the Stonehenge landscape, and I'm going to try and find a suitable way of celebrating this. To me, it's been an enormous privilege. I've had such enjoyment from it. It's provided continuous intellectual stimulation. I've met so many fascinating people. I've heard so many different ideas. I've had so many wonderful discussions, lots with Simon and Tim over curries, which seem to happen fairly regularly. It's been a wonderful journey, and it hasn't finished. The reason that I've called the book that I wrote originally about 10 years ago and revised last year, Stonehenge, the Story So Far, is very deliberate. Because people say, is it a definitive book about Stonehenge? No, it's not. There will never be a definitive book about Stonehenge. It is the story so far. And it is a story that will change and evolve as science evolves and changes. And hopefully in 10 years' time, maybe not me, but somebody else will write Stonehenge, the Story So Far. One of the things I love about it, though, is the fact that it is not only that it's brought me into contact with all sorts of fascinating people. This is Jeremy Deller's recent exhibition called Wiltshire Before Christ, which I wrote the catalogue for. This is the somewhat provocative cover of it. But as I say, it's just so fascinating. I've had great enjoyment from it. We never will answer those questions maybe about how they built Stonehenge, except to say that it wasn't using dinosaurs. I just sort of wait for the next chapter. So I hope that I haven't asked more questions than I've answered. I'm aware that I probably haven't answered very many, but that I've given you an idea of just how dynamic the whole debate is at the moment about so many aspects of Stonehenge, its landscape, and the wider prehistoric past. And I feel very privileged to be a small part of that and to be able to come and talk to you this afternoon. So thank you very much.